Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Professor Madikane. I'm the Vice Principal, Teaching, Learning, Community Engagement, and Student Support. I am presiding over this very important occasion of the University of South Africa, the inaugural lecture of Prof. Segalo. All family, friends, colleagues, everybody, you are most welcome to this lecture. Professor Puleng Lenkabula, Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa, the Executive Dean of the College of Human Sciences, our inaugurant, Professor Segalo, Professor in the Department of Psychology, College of Human Sciences, and our respondent, distinguished Professor Michelle Fine, Professor of Psychology and Urban Studies at the Graduate Center, University of New York, Professor Extraordinaire in the University of South Africa, Department of Psychology. Members of Professor's family in attendance here this afternoon, colleagues, friends, family, and everybody in the university, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Let me start off by presenting my warmest congratulations to Prof. Segalo for this milestone. I offer my warmest congratulations to you, Prof, on your academic success that we're celebrating today. This is the culmination of many, many years of hard work, a long journey, and it is rewarded today through this lecture. The support of your family, of the academic community, of your peers, and your mentors cannot be discounted as having played the greatest role in this achievement. In the University of South Africa, you shall remember, Prof. Segalo, and ladies and gentlemen, that we emphasize Africa-centered values because we believe that the home, the community, are all the first learning centers or the first institutions of knowledge that shape our world and inform our research. And therefore, research, teaching, and the community are always taught together in our university, and they form part of the duty of scholarship. Prof. Segalo, as we reflect on your lecture and the content of your lecture, we are confronted with very interesting, very disturbing, very uncomfortable, but very welcome issues that you raise so bravely. The politics of being, the politics of belonging and being made invisible in a world that you perceive to be your own. Being confronted with issues of race, racism, and the politics of identity, or the politics of not having an identity. Discussing issues of naked racism and being the one who is seen to be in the zone of non-being. Being thrust into the process of critically reflecting on the importance of racial injustice and having to make sure that you claim your space. You claim your space in epistemic justice. These are some of the few issues that you raise, Prof. And really, ladies and gentlemen, this is interesting, but I don't want to steal the thunder from the inaugurant. Therefore, I wish to invite the Executive Dean of the College of Human Sciences to come and introduce the scholar. Prof. Segalo, the scholar, shall be then followed by the respondent, Prof. Michelle Fine, in that order.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. May I acknowledge our Vice Chancellor and Principal, Prof. Lenkabula, our Vice Principal, Teaching, Learning, Community Engagement, and Student Support, Prof. Madikane, our respondent, Distinguished Professor Michelle Fine, and our inaugurant, Prof. Segalo. Prof. Segalo was born in a small rural town called Volvehoek, just outside the town of Sasolburg in the Free State. She spent her childhood years in a township called Zamdela, which is also near Sasolburg. She started her basic education at Malakabeng Primary School and went on to complete primary education at Bofula Tsepe Primary School. Upon completion, she went to Iketsekeng Comprehensive Secondary School, where she obtained her high school certificate. Professor Segalo then enrolled for a BA degree at the University of Pretoria in 1995. She majored in both psychology and anthropology. She was awarded her degree, which she obtained cum laude in 1997. She then went to pursue her honors degree in psychology, which she completed in 1998. While busy with her psychology honors degree, she was approached by the anthropology department to join their teaching staff as a temporary part-time lecturer. She joined the anthropology department and enrolled for an honors degree in anthropology, which she completed in June 1999. In June 2000, Prof. Segalo joined UNISA as a junior lecturer in the Department of Psychology. In September 2002, she enrolled for a master's degree, which she completed in 2004. In 2007, Prof. Segalo was awarded a Fulbright scholarship, which enabled her to go to the United States to pursue her doctoral degree, which she commenced in 2008 at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. While in the United States, Prof. Segalo obtained an MPhil in psychology in 2010, a doctoral certificate in women's studies in 2011, and a doctoral degree in psychology, which was awarded a double distinction in 2013. Whoa, Professor Segalo. Her PhD was awarded the Kunja Mitchell Prize by the City University of New York for work that takes seriously issues of social justice. We applaud you, Prof. Segalo, for your hard work. Upon completion of her doctoral degree, Prof. Segalo returned to the psychology department at UNISA, where she lectured until her secondment to the CHS Research Office, where she took the position of the head of research. She is the recipient of a number of excellent awards. Among these are the 2013 UNISA Principal Prize for Excellence in Research, and 2014 Young Women Scientist of the Year, which was awarded by the National Department of Science and Technology. In 2016, she was appointed as a member of the South African Young Academy of Science, and in 2017 was a finalist for the National Science and Technology Forum, NSTF. In March 2022, she was selected as the regional winner of the 2021 World Academy of Scientists Awards for her contribution in the popularization of science. Prof. Segalo has published over 38 articles in accredited and internationally recognized peer-reviewed journals, conference proceedings, and 9 book chapters. She has also presented and reviewed research papers at over 20 international and 18 national conferences. She has been invited to act as a reviewer for many national and international journals, including the Journal of Psychology in Africa, South African Journal of Psychology, Journal of Black African Theological Studies, Journal of Feminist Africa, Feminism and Psychological Journal, Journal of Peace Psychology, Feminist Africa, and the Journal of Social and Political Psychology. to name just a few. She currently serves as one of the consulting editors for Feminism and Psychology Journal, and also serves as an associate editor for the Journal of Social and Political Psychology. Prof. Segalo has graduated 13 master's and doctoral students to completion. In addition, she has externalized both master's and doctoral dissertations to the University of Johannesburg, Rhodes University, Limpopo University, Sefako Makgato University, Nelson Mandela University, Wits University, and the University of KwaZulu-Natal. In 2017, Prof. Segalo was invited by the National Research Foundation to be one of the expert panel reviewers to go to Switzerland to review the joint Swiss-South Africa funding applications. Prof. Segalo's area of specialization include community psychology, social psychology, and gender and feminism in psychology. Her research work and publications cover a wide range of areas, including gendered experiences of women in various aspects of life, historical trauma, critical participatory research practices, and Africanization. Prof. Segalo is also a C2 NRF rated scholar. Prof. Segalo's research work focuses on experiences of African women and the importance of offering voice to the many muted voices of women. She is interested in the ways in which people navigate and deal with historical traumas in their personal lives and in communities. Her work seeks to find ways in which we can move towards social cohesion, reconciliation, social justice, and psychological healing. Professor Segalo currently holds the position of Chief Albert Luthuli Research Chair, which is housed in the College of Human Sciences. Whoa, Prof. Segalo, we have done such marvelous work. Ladies and gentlemen, let's allow Prof. Segalo to share her inaugural lecture titled A Permit to Exist, On Place Identity, Gender, Trauma, and Non-Belonging. Over to you, Professor Segalo, and thank you very much.
Principal and Vice Chancellor, Professor Puleng Lenkabula, Madam Acting Vice Chancellor, Professor Zodwa Motsa-Madikane, the management of the College of Human Sciences, the university management, my respondent, Professor Michelle Fine, and all of you colleagues attending this lecture today, good afternoon. I would like to start by acknowledging those who accompany me, the ones whose daughter I am, Batswening, and the ones whose granddaughter I am, Batau. They guide me, they protect me, and for that, I honor and thank them. My mother, Malishwane Segalo, I dedicate this lecture to you. You taught me that we can never truly reclaim what was lost, that it is important for us to remember the past, that we should remember and mourn the loss, but refuse to be stuck in the past. You taught me that we should use the present to consistently work for what is good and for what we hope for in the future. Through this lecture, I honor all the women who refuse to be silent in the face of injustice, the women who consciously and continuously choose life in a world that constantly renders them disposable, the women who choose to love, even though sometimes it is those whom they love that hack and stuff them inside fridges and suitcases, the women who hold families together, even though the structural challenges make it difficult to sustain healthy families. To Professor Michelle Fine, my intellectual spirit goddess, thank you for choosing me. Your scholarly nurturing has sustained and offered me the vocabulary and tools to speak back and forever ask questions. I have journeyed with an amazing cohort of students, colleagues, and mentors who have immensely contributed to my academic development. Today is not about me, but all of us. Peace Kigua, thank you for being by my side, believing in what is possible in me. I value you deeply and so grateful to have you in my life. Tembela Vokwana, Natalia Mulebatsi, Edward Fori, Martin Terblanche, Azui Mavandu Muzusi, Angelo Finn, Kelebabang Mukhupi, Sipokazi Magadla. There are so many of you, and that for me is testimony to the fact that the journey becomes easier and bearable when you have support. I might have not mentioned you by name, but please know that I'm grateful for the role that you have all played in this journey. This celebration is for all of us. I've always been preoccupied with and interested in issues of identity and belonging. Identity in the broad sense, but with particular attention to gender identity, place identity, and belonging. My research interest has been on the impact of displacement, dispossession, being disenfranchised, and the overarching experience of being dehumanized. It is at these intersections and multi-dimensions that I pay attention to the everydayness of trauma and human suffering. My research specifically zooms in on the woundedness of women who have been fearful of loving in a world that renders them as illegitimate beings whose place in the world is always in question. My research journey engages research questions and preoccupations that started when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Pretoria, where I was confronted with race and racism and the politics of identity and belonging, or not belonging. It was in the interactions, encounters with physical structures such as buildings, and confrontation with physical hostility that I became solely aware of my blackness and what it represents. At that place, my blackness was a problem, and here I align with W.E.B. Du Bois' pertinent question of how does it feel to be a problem? The everydayness of being a problem was in the mundane, when someone refused to sit next to you in a bus from the student housing to campus, when you see blunt segregation in the dining halls, and when announcements were made only in Afrikaans. It was in these moments of encounters that I actually started reflecting on the importance of racial injustice, racial justice, and epistemic justice. The very idea of what it means to belong and what it means to be an outsider. And here I echo Swanton, who argues that race takes form in multiple contingent and devious ways and gives shape to encounters. Swanton goes on to argue that theorizing race as a technology of differentiation that sorts human into differences in ways that acknowledge the malleability of race and the more than human composition of social relations. He goes on to outline an understanding of racism, a racism of assemblages, that recognizes that the sorting of human difference is also accompanied by judgments that prefigure encounters. I grappled with these complex and alienating encounters from my undergraduate studies all the way to my master's, where I examined the politics of place identity. That is, having to navigate with what Jasbe Poor calls bodies out of place and what Hugo Canham calls reviled bodies, where you are constantly reminded that you do not belong. You do not represent what the place stands for. Canham argues that there are those who belong, while the recent arrivals, those of us who joined the institutions after 1994, can be read as imposters in a space that was not created for them. I became preoccupied with engaging the importance of what it means to be treated with dignity, where each person's humanity is respected. And here for me, Kimberly Crenshaw becomes very useful. Kimberly Crenshaw offered me the vocabulary to think about how struggles are not the same and how important it is to take seriously the intersectionality of people's lives. According to Crenshaw, intersectionality is an analytic sensibility, a way of thinking about identity and its relationship to power. Poor moves beyond intersections and introduces what she calls assemblages, where our bodies are in a constant state of becoming and therefore cannot be restricted to rigid labeling and categorizing. Of course, this idea of becoming is in line with the African worldview and its notion of personhood as always becoming. So how do we become with distorted histories? When we are racially marked, when our cultures are seen as backward, how do we imagine gender justice in the midst of this erasure? It is with these questions that I zoom in on the meaning of gendered struggles, and more specifically, Black women's struggles. So, ladies and gentlemen, in this lecture, I offer some reflections on the everydayness of gendered trauma, the languaging or vocabulary of trauma, how we can draw from visual methodologies to speak the unspeakable. And also, I zoom in on visual methods as decolonial practice. Women's stories have and continue to be written in the visible and invisible part of their bodies. Stories of shame, of anger, of joy, of desire, of pain, of oppression, but of resistance and survival as well. I was raised by many such women, a community that comprised of women who lived through various oppressive regimes, who built families and communities amidst the storms of colonization and apartheid. As Bell Hooks, even though she was speaking in the context of the United States, as she aptly put it, historically, African American people believed that the construction of a home place, however fragile and tenuous, for example, the slave hut, the wooden shack, had a racial political dimension. Despite the brutal reality of racial apartheid, of domination, one's home place was the one site where one could freely confront the issue of humanization, where one could resist. Black women resisted by making homes where all Black people could strive to be subjects and not objects, where we could be affirmed in our minds and hearts despite poverty, hardship, and deprivation, where we could restore ourselves the dignity denied to us on the outside in the public world. It is these silenced and invisibilized stories that my work seeks to engage with, to listen to, and to learn from. Many South African women have and continue to be rendered mute, their bodies are deemed disposable, and their everyday existence is under constant surveillance. Many have stood up and loudly challenged and negated this assumption of helplessness and voicelessness. Many are in the public eyes with narratives that have been penned by themselves and others on their behalf. I draw inspiration from South African feminist literary scholars such as Barbara Boswell, Sindiwe Magona, Phumla Dineo-Qola, Matsilo Motsei, and Loretta Ngcobo. In their words, They grapple with the ways in which South African black women navigated the oppressive apartheid systems through actions such as refusing to carry the pass, survived forced removals, and managed to create homes in the midst of impossible living conditions and movement restrictions. Through their works, these authors offer voice and space for women to speak back, to reflect, and to challenge the often skewed master narratives that focus on equality and gender justice. Through such feminist imaginations and imaginings, I look at mapped bodies. Women are mapped bodies that continue to be butchered constantly, and through my work, I call for the imagining of a different existence, a different reality. I grapple with political vernaculars of freedom, of loss, of love, and of mourning. I do this because there continues to be stories that many people who have experienced traumatic and oppressive past carry with them, stories that continue to remain untold. It is important, therefore, to interrogate and revisit experiences of the past, to offer them space to be told and retold in the journey to meaning-making. Gordon points out in her book that we need to consider what she calls the alternative diagnostics, which will give us space to rethink master narratives and consider what has been excluded. It is these alternative diagnostics that I'm interested in as I attempt to look for ways in which the private memories and lived experiences of women who lived through apartheid in South Africa can be given space to be heard. This is where my work begins. But my work is nestled between psychology and women's studies. And so I start by challenging my own home discipline, psychology. With this, I shift to zoom in on the thrust of my work. In my work, I ask these broad questions. How might we engage critical psychology, scholarship, theory, and practice otherwise? Now that we know and cannot deny the steady stream of racialized and gendered violence that confront us daily, that reverberate under the soles of our feet. How do we theorize pain, social injustice, and collective suffering? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm interested in the critical project of decolonizing knowledges, which involves contesting what liberation psychologist Ignacio Martín Baró calls the collective lies that are being told about people, their histories, and their lived experiences. Martín Baró argues that if human beings are products of history, then clearly the particular history will have repercussions on the mental health of people. He goes on to argue that this impact will be referred to as psychosocial trauma. And so it is this psychosocial trauma that I place my work on, how we carry the wounds of colonialism, of apartheid, of government states that do not put people's wellness at the center of their agenda. I'm specifically interested in how all these wounds, often invisible, show themselves in the ways in which women navigate the world, where they are perpetually confronted by social and psychical trauma. My work, therefore, engages social suffering and trauma at the intersection of both the individual and the collective. This means doing research focusing on gender, on community well-being, on disciplinary relevance, on place identity, and on belonging. And so I've put together the broad framing that assists me to contextualize the work that I'm doing. So trauma and suffering, looking at the meaning of everyday suffering, how we can confront the colonial wounds. I'm interested in gendered suffering because I want to zoom in on the gendered phase of oppression and the everyday survival strategies that many women have adopted. I'm also interested over and above on the well-being of our communities, how we relate to one another and contribute to each other's wellness, how to contribute to the dis-ease that is there in many of our communities. And I do this drawing from visual methodologies as a lens and an epistemological methodology that assists me to be able to make sense of these issues that I look at. How can we put together these testimonies of trauma, of suffering, and engage with them visually? And of course, I'm interested in the decolonization and Africanization agenda. How can the decolonization and Africanization project be used to assist us with the vocabulary of imagining the world anew? I was drawn to psychology because of the opportunity I believe it offers to think about our relationship to one another and how we can understand wellness in relation to how we engage in and with the world. The bigger question that I continuously grapple with is, how can psychology assist us in the ways in which we contemplate and approach societal challenges? To think about how psychology responds to societal challenges requires us to first start by taking a step back and reflect on how psychology as a discipline in its theorization and its practice has normalized the framing of certain subjects, often white, as norms, and others, often black, as a problem. This problematic framing was legitimized by how skewed our research endeavors and theorizations were, and in many ways continue to be. This framing contributes to the politics of belonging and its parameters of insider and outsider politics. The discipline itself has over a long period of time cultivated alienation of some subjects that come into the discipline. We also need to acknowledge the shameful role that the discipline, we also need to acknowledge the shameful role the discipline played in the development of apartheid and actively contributed to constructing the other as subhuman and deserving of repression. I argue that we need to reflect and engage with this first layer of the discipline before we consider the actual disciplinary practice itself. We need to engage with and confront the historical ghosts that continue to linger. It is important to take the discipline and turn it towards itself, because in so doing, we lay the ground or foundation for doing truly healing work. I have argued in my earlier work that psychology has for a long time been quick to diagnose trauma and trauma victims and trauma experiences from an individualistic perspective, almost always positioning the problem within the person. Within psychology, post-traumatic stress disorder has become the way to operationalize suffering. And I worry that this has occluded how suffering lives in a body, how it lives in a family, in a community, through cognitions, through memory, through embodiments, in voice and in silence, over time and in aftershocks of displacement, of family disruption, of intergenerational hauntings, and physical and mental trauma. It is the holistic and intersectional understanding of suffering that is required for us to truly imagine the possibility for a psychology that contributes towards healing. My work in particular looks at the gendered experiences in communities. Gendered experiences, but also issues of social justice and the role that psychology can play and contribute towards a socially just society. So, while I engage with gender and women's place in society, how they continue to be peripheralized and treated as subhuman, I'm also interested in what trauma looks like in the everyday experiences of women. How does trauma travel with people in their bodies, in their interrelationships, and in their intimate experiences as well? I'm also interested in the relationship between historical trauma and trauma as experienced in the now, and how these can be understood in relation to one another. I try to think critically about how we can engage with the possibility of healing from trauma and why we need to understand how trauma manifests, how it is a collective experience, and how it is political, historical, and manifests also in economic issues. How can our understanding of trauma from these multidimensional levels enable us to understand the way in which it travels and maps itself in our bodies, in the lives of women? How may we theorize multiple forms of trauma, perpetual woundedness from community level and from an African worldview perspective? Some of the scholars whom I have journeyed with in my grappling with ways in which we can understand the social and multidimensional layers of trauma include Summerfield, it includes Kleinman and Farmer. I've also journeyed with Shepard Hughes, and Leslie's work has also been very helpful in thinking about psychological healing. And Candip's work, who argues that suffering should be understood in the broad sense as encompassing more than the actual physical pain, but one that also includes situated, social, embodied, and shared experience of painful, traumatic, hurtful, physical, and psychological pain. And of course, I also drew from Liam's work, who speaks on the importance of recovering memories, who speaks about the effects of intergenerational trauma and what happens to trauma if it's not given attention, how it moves and shows itself from one generation to another. It is at this point that I connect psychology with the project of Africanization and decolonization. I came to the realization of the need to challenge and problematize what it means to produce knowledge and the ways in which it gets disseminated. In 2014, I became involved in the Decoloniality Project, and its theoretical framing assisted me with the tools to use in my work in psychology and gender. I shifted my focus to look at the ways in which the work we do serves or can serve the decolonization agenda. This assisted with taking my work beyond what I had been focusing on earlier, for example, in my PhD work, and building on it as I grapple with ways in which psychology can truly serve within the context it is being practiced and applied. I start by arguing that there is a need to disrupt hegemonic knowledges by inserting ourselves in ways that serve us. This position enables us to be anti-Eurocentric without being anti-European. While appreciating the contributions made by European theories, I argue for the right to critique the ways in which they have subordinated other epistemologies. I further contend that there must be a space for dialogical engagement between Eurocentric and African knowledge systems on an equal basis. It is at this point where my work on decolonial and African-centered psychology comes in. I work at the intersection of multiple disciplines as a way of undoing what Lewis Gordon calls disciplinary decadence, which is the privileging of one's own discipline at the expense of others. African view of the world is premised on the idea that personhood, that is being human, can be understood in relation to other people. The colonial project thrived because of the categorization of human beings, with black women being relegated to the bottom of humanity. However, it is critical to note that black women's suffering is directly linked to the suffering of both black men and children. Understanding this first and foremost, this position of how suffering broadly manifests will assist us to grapple with how we can respond to societal changes such as gendered trauma. For example, the problem of femicide, of domestic violence, of rape that we see so often in our country, that a week does not go by where we do not hear of horrific encounters that women have had in the hands of men, either men that they love or men who are strangers. So for all of us to be able to really understand all of these, right, we need to understand that these need to be read via the lens of historical trauma. As we continue to theorize and attempt to make meaning of our individual contexts and the globe, it is critical to do so with what Thomas Teo calls epistemic modesty, instead of self-assured statements of generalizability. Taking a decolonial standpoint allows us to acknowledge the multiplicity of knowledges and theorizing. We need to be humble and embrace the possibility and legitimacy of indigenous knowledges and wisdoms. Thomas Teo warns that the critique of colonial psychology, where the call is to adopt a decolonial approach, and the support for indigenous psychologies, also requires going beyond decolonization as metaphor. So we should not just be talking about decoloniality, right, as this noble innocence. But we need to understand them. We need to understand decolonization. We need to understand Africanization as part of a struggle for intellectual and social justice here at home and abroad. Psychology as a discipline needs to take seriously its training practices. That is the form of the training, the shape, and also the content of our training. The mode of that training is also very important. For example, we need to take seriously the role of language in our teaching of psychology. We do so by acknowledging that language is not culturally or ideologically neutral, and that the hegemony of the English language inexorably marginalizes local languages and their embedded history, the practices, the knowledges, and the wisdoms that are found within these languages, as Neville Alexander argues. We need to do this so that many of us can move away from the feeling of alienation where we do not relate to what psychology is, what it does, and what it can do, because of how it is brought into our communities. The alienation that I speak of happens at the level of pedagogy, in what we choose to privilege, in what is lost when we only focus on foreign languages. The move towards Africanization requires us to embark on the journey of relearning. Relearning means moving away from how colonialism and Eurocentric education has made us strangers to ourselves, as argued by Chabani Manganyi. We need to acknowledge that we have always been people with identities, with a sense of belonging, and who have rich histories that have been intentionally erased by colonialism. African cosmologies and ways of being in the world continue to be erased and be absent in the classrooms. The process of relearning means getting to know ourselves again. When we speak about Ubuntu, what fundamentally does that mean in terms of people connecting with one another? What does healing mean in an African framing of wellness? This project of unlearning and relearning is at the center of the decolonial project. Decolonization is about understanding that we are on this journey of rediscovery, and this journey is also at the same time the journey of healing, the journey of psychic healing, generational healing, the journey of acknowledging the trauma we have experienced over generations. It is acknowledging that part of the healing process involves getting to know ourselves again. Having critical consciousness about what it means to embrace and love Blackness and loving other Black people. The project is not an individual project. It is a collective endeavor. It is multidimensional work that requires the enthusiastic contribution of all of us. It requires psychology to challenge itself, to critique its problematic history and embark in the process of remaking and redefining itself within an Afrocentric framework. To Africanize is to think seriously about the theories we use and about the methods we use. It is for this reason that I draw from visual methodologies, from the visual arts as a way to reimagine how we grapple with notions of trauma and gendered suffering. So how do I employ these visual methods in my work? I shall illustrate through offering examples of some of the projects I have been working on over the years. Part of what over the years I've been thinking about is how we can think critically and creatively about issues of trauma. How can we think about possible platforms and ways in which people can reflect, can remember, and as Ngugi wa Thiong'o argues, we need to remember fractured parts of ourselves. And in turn, with that, with what it means to be a Black person, and in a context such as South Africa. A place with a history of intense racial discrimination and where Black people were seen as subhuman. And I say were seen, while I believe that in many ways it continues to be so in the present, that Black people are perceived as subhuman. I was further interested in how racial discrimination existed alongside gender discrimination, and how all these are critical in our sense of belonging and non-belonging. Can one truly feel like they belong within spaces where they are forever relegated to the periphery? Can women truly belong when they are fearful of their lives when they enter a taxi? Part of me contemplating on these questions and issues meant seriously engaging my own disciplinary framing and the methodologies we work with. We often use interviews, we often use questionnaires, While these methods are useful, I found that they did not fully address the kind of work that I wanted to do. The work of really delving into and engaging the work of memory and trauma at a social level, and engaging with and problematizing how suffering manifests within society. When I started my work, I was interested in the ways in which apartheid shaped communities, the lives of Black people within these communities, and Black women's lives more specifically. The narratives of trauma that many Black women experienced appeared to me to be muted in many spaces and platforms. One needs to look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as an example. And many scholars, and myself included, reflected on this silencing of women's narratives in such platforms. I was interested in engaging in the ways in which apartheid was an integral part of the everyday. How it entered our homes, our intimate spaces such as bedrooms, and various family sacred spaces. To engage and put a spotlight on these experiences using methodological tools such as interviews seemed to me very limited. In her book, The Unsayable, The Hidden Trauma, The Hidden Language of Trauma, Anne Rogers highlights the need to find other modes of languaging trauma as a way to creating space and giving voice to the unsayable. So how do we engage and capture these unsayable traumatic experiences in a way that attends to their fullness? How do we talk about unsayable things? The stigmas linked and connected to the kinds of experiences that people have gone through. With these questions in mind, I started thinking about what is there in our communities that women already do and already know that could then be used to tell the unsayable and reveal the hidden transcripts. This is how I came to using embroideries as alternative diagnostics. I looked at ways in which we could use embroidery to tell stories, to communicate the ways in which the personal is also political, and to use embroidery as a tool that women could draw from to visibilize the oppressive historical and present experiences that they encountered and continue to encounter. The plan was to reimagine needle and textile work as more than just feminine and decorative forms of expression. The idea was to challenge the divide between the beautiful, the provocative, and the political as a way to highlight how art forms such as embroidery could also be used as a form of resistance and of challenging the oppressive systems. So I thought of ways in which we could use the visual art forms to tell hidden stories of gendered trauma, and in particular, how apartheid affected and continues to affect women's lives. And so I started by embarking on a project that looked at women's experiences of growing up during apartheid. I focused on the women's life histories as shaped and influenced by apartheid and the meaning of reflecting back to this past and the implications of the past in the present. What the embroideries allowed us to do as a collective in the community is that it was not a time-specific project. It was a long-term project that went on for a period of months, and allowed the women to connect communally. While they worked on embroideries that focused on their individual stories, they also shared collective stories. The making of embroideries created an opportunity and opened up a space wherein the women could share hidden narratives with family and not just with each other. Because untold stories lead to silences being passed on from one generation to the next. Often, parents craft official scripts of what stories to share, but what about that which remains untold? In her extensive work focusing on the Japanese internment, Nagata looked at how silences carried by the parents continued to haunt the children as well. And this is where the challenge of intergenerational trauma becomes manifest. The embroidery project aimed at telling and unveiling those hidden narratives. This project was about remembering, about healing, and allowing a platform and a space to express some of the experiences that Black women went through that they never got the opportunity to speak about or to share, that they struggled to articulate in words. Visual methodologies such as embroidery show the power of the work of art towards psychological healing. Beyond women sharing their embroideries with each other, the work can be displayed and exhibited in ways that allows others to engage with the artworks, and so allows for continuous and multiple interpretation of the work. Furthermore, as art forms, the personally narrated embroideries are able to travel from one context to another. With embroideries, narratives of pain, of loss, of grief, of trauma can be artistically carved on cloth, which serves as a canvas that points to survival amidst devastation. I offer embroidery as a tool and a research methodology that people in communities can relate to, as it is an art and mode of communication that many people embedded within communities can understand. Embroidery is a creative methodology and mode of knowledge production that refuses to be bounded by disciplinary rules. By drawing on such methodologies, we can aesthetically, visually, and creatively tell stories about trauma and systemic injustices that would otherwise not be easy to talk about. If we engage psychological healing with what we already know, with tools we have at our disposal, showing how people are an integral part of producing knowledge, allowing for multiple and collective owning of the narrative of healing, and keeping in mind the physical labor of embroidery, and putting the past and the present in the same canvas as a way to understand lived realities, we move closer to realizing a decolonized reality. I offer a few samples of the embroidery work, focusing on gendered historical trauma. I shall not explain the embroidery, but I hope that by looking at the embroidery, one can see the ways in which women place themselves at the center of the narrative, but also show how their personal stories is also very political, as what happened to them and what continues to happen to them cannot be divorced or separated from what's happening around in the community, what's happening in society. Using tactile visual images such as embroidery, as you see, to tell a story is an intriguing form of cross-referencing of art with narration. So it's not just about the visual, but the story behind the visual. What is the visual narrating to you as the viewer? It opens up further spaces for such cross-referencing between other art forms and enables women who survived substantial assaults against their material, social, and cultural bodies to reclaim their identity and their sense of agency, reconstituting discontinuous subjectivities and repositioning themselves. I have highlighted elsewhere again in this work that the use of the visual image is a useful tool that can be used to tell people's stories of oppression, of liberation, and of survival. Visual images can be used purposefully to mediate reality in a performative way. And furthermore, they allow for collective emotional response, What is it that the viewer feels? What is it that the viewer imagines? How does the viewer connect with the artwork in front of them? Using visual images such as embroideries to tell stories enables women who survived horrific assaults against their material, social, and cultural bodies, as I said, to reclaim them and reconstitute again the repositioning of themselves. So, how do I then continue with this work in thinking about going forward and going ahead, and other ways in which embroideries can be useful for us? So I think with you today on my ongoing and future work, specifically focusing on the embroidery and the everydayness of gender-based violence, very much interconnected with the issue of trauma, zooming in specifically on gender-based violence. The South African democratic freedom does not necessarily lend itself to automatic access to power, as we know and have come to learn over time, and resources that Black people were excluded from before. We are now grappling with other forms of exclusion, masked in what decolonial scholars called coloniality. This means while official colonialism and apartheid may be over, their remnants and systems of power can still be felt. For example, through imported theories that continue to be imposed on students through Euro-Western prescribed texts, we can see how coloniality then continues. With this in mind, therefore, I am in agreement with Yuval Davis in her call for a theory of citizenship and of being that acknowledges everyday struggles of race, of class, and of gender. Acknowledging the everyday struggles that people have to continuously contend with may offer some space to make sense of these intersecting issues and possible understanding of how meaning is made. I draw from Susan Apatow, who suggests that narratives of the past may not be so easy to be recollected. However, for reconciliation to take place, these narratives should be allowed space in the present. While there is somewhat of a shift in gender dynamics as women are getting access to education and securing jobs, it is worth noting that there is still a long way to go. For example, the 2021 labor force stats show that 36% of working age women are unemployed compared to 32% of men. When you break this down by race, 41% of Black women were unemployed compared to only 8.2% of white women, 22% of Indian women, and 29% of colored women. While women accounted for 43% of the employed, only 33% were in managerial roles compared to 66% of men. Women were largely employed in domestic work, clerical, and technical occupations. This is despite more women graduating with a degree than men. Therefore, for sustainable progress to take place, women's silent knowings should be acknowledged and offered space, as failure to do so might hinder many of them from realizing their potential. Again, Yuval Davis asserts that participation in the public domain does not equate higher degree of empowerment. By taking seriously and paying attention to gender as a unit of analysis in our theorizing, we might move a step closer to an understanding of the dynamics and complexities of gender politics in our everyday lives. And with this, I think about ways in which to take my work forward. I have thus shifted to thinking about the everydayness of gendered violence. And I do this always acknowledging the impact of colonialism in the complex relationships and entanglements people have in their everyday experiences. The challenge of gender-based violence in South Africa is pervasive and complex. And this was also highlighted by the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Dubravka Simonovic, who a couple of years ago in their visit to South Africa observed the following, and I quote, "I have heard on many occasions that violence against women is normalized in South Africa. The violence inherited from apartheid still resonates profoundly in South African society, dominated by deeply entrenched patriarchal attitudes towards the role of women in society, which makes violence against women and children an almost accepted social phenomenon. Despite an arsenal of progressive laws and policies to deal with gender-based violence put very ably in place, there has been little implementation, hence little impact, and gender-based violence continues to be pervasive and at the level of systemic women's human rights violations." She said this in 2015, and I'm sure you'll agree with me that in 2022, this continues to ring true. And I have started looking again visually at what gender-based violence looks like in our everyday encounters, in the home, in the streets, in the workplace. My focus is looking at what can be achieved when women reflect together. What can be achieved if we draw from the power of the collective? Black South African women have for a long time believed in the power of the collective. Their belief in solidarity and collective resistance has always been one of their strategies for survival. Importantly, the solidarity is not in isolation, but in recognition of their coexistence with men, as I've said earlier. This recognition assisted in fighting the apartheid regime, where women understood that their freedom was interwoven with that of their male counterparts. I continue to work with a women's collective called Intuthuko, based in Ekurhuleni in the Gauteng province here in South Africa. We came together collectively to engage the ways in which we could creatively make meaning of gender-based violence in our communities. We sought to create a space where we could together imagine ways in which challenges faced by communities because of gendered violence could be given attention. The project followed participatory action research, where I worked collaboratively with the women to produce knowledge through the making of embroideries. Working collaboratively affords what Moya, as cited in Kigua, calls epistemic privilege. The notion of epistemic privilege for Black women is only possible when they collectively acknowledge their shared and similar experiences, as argued by Kigua. Methodologically, we aimed to practically show how visual methodologies and approaches could be sources of knowledge based on skills that communities already have. The intended outcome was to show the possibility embroideries hold in assisting us to paint a picture of gender-based violence challenges faced by communities and visually depict, as you can see, ways in which meaning is made around experiences, perceptions, and challenges related to gendered violence. The following questions steered our process. What are the various forms of gendered violence in our communities? How can community women give attention to challenges faced by communities because of gender-based violence? And how can embroideries be used to speak back and make visible the various ways in which gender-based violence manifests? In the spirit of centering indigenous knowledge systems in my work, I draw from the Maori notion of kaupapa, as introduced to us by Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, which privileges the principles of collective philosophy and acknowledges communities' aspirations, their ideals, and their hopes. Kaupapa is in line with the African notion of Ubuntu, which speaks to how a person is who they are through other people, that our well-being is interlinked with that of others. Drawing from these indigenous philosophies, it makes sense to approach my research process from a participatory perspective. We therefore need to rethink the ways in which we work together with communities. We need to create spaces where our community research collaborators have a more visible and bigger stake in the kinds of projects that happen within their spaces. We need to think of ways and possibilities of having research projects that get developed alongside or with community members. We conduct research in communities that still carry the scars of colonial exploitation and that continue to suffer from structural inequities and lack of access to valuable resources. It is pertinent, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, that we acknowledge this, be humble, and conduct our work in ways that represent and respect the humanity and dignity of people. In her book entitled Rape, a South African Nightmare, Inaugural introduces us to the concept of the female fear factory. Gola argues that we live in a society where fear is manufactured, is created and produced by patriarchal and unjust structural violence systems, which in turn leads to women living in perpetual fear. The high rates of gendered violence which are perpetrated against women means they cannot feel safe within and outside of their homes. Their bodies are regulated and controlled. In other words, they do not entirely own their bodies. Gender-based violence thrives because of the lack of support and safe spaces for those who are violated to share their experiences. Some choose to keep quiet because of the shame, further victimization, and threats that, should they speak, they will be in more danger. It is only through ensuring that accountability and prosecution takes place that justice can be realized. It is when the judiciary system does not treat women as suspects who are to be listened to with suspicions that we may move towards real accountability and the possibility of a safe world for those who suffer gendered violence. We continue on a journey to fight for the humanity of women and their right to exist in a world where their very existence of being women does not put them at perpetual risk of unspeakable violations and even death. We need to collectively critique, challenge, and work collaboratively for social justice. We are communities under siege, and we need to demand justice and acknowledgement of women as fully human and that their humanity should be protected. I echo Eze's assertion that to write about the wrongs of society is to take steps towards righting them by drawing people's attention to them. Because silence should never be an option in the face of violations of human rights. My work seeks to visually depict the myriad ways in which gender-based violence manifests in the various corners of our society, and to lay bare its multidimensional nature. At the moment, I'm working on a sub-project of gender-based violence where together with a colleague, Veronica Mitchell, from the medical field, we are using embroidery to bring attention to obstetric violence. To give attention to these multi-dimensions of gender-based violence requires a systemic, micro, macro, and multidimensional approach that involves all members and sectors of the society. From the judiciary to the survivors of gender-based violence, and including the perpetrators as well. It has been noted that toxic masculinity is the driver of gender-based violence. Therefore, retributive justice systems are not very effective in addressing the issue, as they either mismanage the cases or imprison the perpetrator, who then returns to society, often more damaged and indoctrinated than before. Also, women often retract cases, we know this, sometimes out of fear of losing the income of their partner, who may be the breadwinner. Restorative justice, on the other hand, argues for the inclusion of both survivor and perpetrator in a dialectical process and for reskilling perpetrators with better communication skills and challenging deeply held beliefs that are toxic. The possibility, ladies and gentlemen, of a truly just world requires the buy-in of all of us. And with this, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you. Ke a leboha.
It's an honor to be here with you all today. Let me acknowledge Madam Acting Vice Chancellor, Professor Zodwa Motsa Madikane, the college and university management, my amazing colleague, friend, sister, daughter, Dr. Puleng Segalo, and all of you who are here to appreciate the work and brilliance of Dr. Segalo. Let me begin by thanking Dr. Segalo's mother for allowing Puleng to live in our world for a bit while she taught us, she learned with us, she sat beside us, and then she returned to the land where she knows she belongs, a land that loves her. But I thank you for sharing her, because Dr. Segalo has unalterably changed my life. So let me turn to you, Dr. Segalo, for your gorgeous, brilliant talk. Puleng Segalo, in her talk, elegantly stitches scholarship at the intersection of history, aesthetics, and critical psychology. She draws on threads the color of Black South African women's experience, their passions, blood, laughter, creativity, fears, and their radical courage. Puleng Segalo has entered the transnational academic stage as a theorist, an ethicist, an oral historian, and an artist committed to carrying with dignity stories of struggle and resistance. I'm going to tell you her gifts as if you don't know them. Most elegantly, Dr. Segalo brings what Shoshi Kessi calls epistemic justice to her work. That is, she knows in her belly, in her heart, in her mind, that knowledge is widely distributed, even if the academy claims monopoly ownership of knowledge. She knows there's knowledge in embroidery collectives, around kitchen tables, in townships across oceans, and she enacts that in her scholarship. The second gift is that she refuses the binaries that so populate popular discourse. She allows us to understand that violence sits side by side with laughter, that oppression and resistance sit together. She conducts work that is rooted in place and travels across the globe. She gives us stories of home, of townships, stories of her aunties, the embroidery collective. She insists on the Africanization of psychology. She has a fierce and delicate rejection of either Eurocentric knowledge or the academy as the sole purveyor of knowledge. Puleng pays exquisite attention to what she calls the everydayness of trauma, the woundedness of women, the treatment of women and femmes as illegitimate beings, out of place, reviled, in the language of her colleague, Hugo Canham. But Puleng Like our great ancestor Frantz Fanon, Puleng understands that from wounds bleed creativity. She knows that Black South African women's resistance must be named and repeated so that it is in the record, stitched onto the fabric. She forces us to remember South African Black women navigated oppressive apartheid, refusing to carry passbooks, surviving forced removals, and managing still to create homes in the midst of impossible life conditions and movement restrictions. She knows she stands on ancestors and she holds the hands of her scholarly peers. So she, of course, cites Barbara Boswell, Sindui Magona, Pumla Denio Gola, Machilo Motsef, and Loretta Makobo. Apologies if I didn't pronounce correctly, because she knows her mamas, her sisters, her aunties at home, in the academy, in the embroidery collective, and on Fifth Avenue in New York City. But most fundamentally, Puleng embraces an African worldview. She brings Ubuntu to all of her scholarship and teaching. She sees, writes, and makes visible the spider webs that attach all of us. Her invitation to me is part of that beautiful Segalo spider web that attach history to tomorrow, women to men, children, femmes, trans, spider webs that attach violence and love. Puleng has a soft, fierce conviction to interrupt silences and to unsettle, even silences that persist today through reconciliation. Asking always whose story has not been told, where are the holes in our collective fabric, and how do we suffer if collective lies and silences saturate our everyday existence? Puleng, you are a doula, a midwife of aesthetic narratives, a major young scholarly voice in critical psychology, upending notions of expertise, knowledge production, aesthetic provocation, and the ethical precarities of representation. With needles and thread, ink and scholarly writing, you have pierced the silenced fabrics, the history of how South African Black women survived apartheid, but you have also intended to create materials that speak back to those communities and pierce the consciousness of those in the global north, those of us who are white, those of us who are living in colonial, oppressive, increasingly autocratic nations, those of us who thought we were outside that struggle. You are reminding us that we too are implicated and obligated. You have pierced our consciousness. And then in her essay, Puleng goes further. She pricks our naive desire to believe, well, apartheid was then, and now things are fine. She insists that we contend, that you contend, that I contend with current circumstances. That in 2021 labor force statistics, that 41% of Black women in South Africa are unemployed, compared to 8.2% of white women, 22% of Indian women, 29% of colored women, and still primarily situated, some in management, but largely in domestic work, clerical work, technical. You insist that we see Puleng, and you ask us to take off our blinders about then and now. You offer us 3 provocations, and I'm going to offer you 2. Your 3 provocations. You insist that we understand the harms not only of colonialism, but as psychology, as a discipline that has carried the fierce edge of colonial categories, stratifications, diagnoses, and hierarchies. Your second provocation is in your talk, in your writing, you invite listeners, readers, to sit beside you on a bus as others moved away from you when you were just a young college student. You suture readers and writers, listeners and speakers. You insist that we hear the rational arguments that you're making and feel the affective jabs that you are insisting that we also recognize. And the third is that you make an optimistic offering, Pulang, towards solidarity, toward becoming. Without romance, you tell us that personhood is always becoming. And then you ask, so how do we become with distorted histories when we're racially marked? Our cultures are seen as backward. How do we imagine gender justice in the midst of this erasure? So my provocations to you, my dear sister, daughter, colleague, friend, I imagine a longitudinal archive. I imagine young women embroidering with elders as their audience. I imagine elders writing to creating embroideries for young women and creating a longitudinal archive that tells the stories of then and now. And I know your work on obstetric violence will begin to enter that archive. Second is I hope you can begin, as you have in so many of your writings, to deeply theorize the relation of colonial violence, state violence, and gendered violence in your country and in mine. The persistence of gendered violence against women and femmes and trans folks. It's a South Africa story, but it's a United States story. And we must understand the relentless, bloody persistence of gendered violence in the midst of state violence and colonial violence. And of course, how radical on the ground organizing can interrupt such violence. And the third is to understand how patriarchy metabolizes into property. For those men who are most marginalized, but again, in my country, those men who are most privileged. We witness gendered violence across households. Some women pay a deeper price, some women have options to leave. But this is a trans class and trans race phenomenon deeply rooted, as you acknowledge, in some communities, but it bleeds across. Pulang, you have told us that you will continue your embroidery work with the Intutuko-based women's collective in the Gutan province, engaging what you call epistemic privilege, borrowing from Moya, which you argue is possible only when Black women collectively acknowledge their similar and shared experiences. You ask at the end of your talk, where is the light on gender-based violence? And I will tell you that Pulang Segalo is the light on gender-based violence. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you, to honor you, to congratulate you, and to speak to your mama. Thank you all.
Well, let me say congratulations and well done. Well done, Prof. Segalo. This is a job well done. I wish to welcome you aboard the community of scholars on behalf of the University of South Africa. Congratulations to you. We are very proud of you. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Principal and the Vice Chancellor of our university, the University of South Africa, I wish to bring this event to a close. And I wish to say the celebration doesn't end here. We shall continue to celebrate this eminent work done by Prof. Segalo. And we are wishing her all the best in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, I am now ending this event formally, and I wish to say good night, enjoy yourselves, celebrate more, research more, nihambe kahle, siyabonga. Thank you.